Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Slover Library's virtual roundtable panel discussion on the topic Democracy in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Josie Boys, and I am the Adult Programs Librarian for the Slover Library. First, we're going to introduce our panel. We have Jerry Hebert. He's the Senior Director for Voting Rights and Redistricting at the Campaign Legal Center. He joined the Campaign Legal Center in 2004. From 1973 to 1994, Jerry worked for the U.S. Department of Justice, where he served in many roles, including acting chief deputy chief and special litigation counsel in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division. In his he served as the lead attorney in numerous voting rights and redistricting lawsuits. Jerry is also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C., where he teaches courses on voting rights, election law, and campaign finance regulation. Our panel's moderator tonight is Tim Smith. He's an executive producer of Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook, as well as a short film we're going to see tonight, Voter Fraud Busters. Mr. Smith is a veteran of both television and documentary production, having been a production executive with MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and now the American Institutions Initiative, which produced Rigged. Mr. Smith's work has won 2 Emmys and 5 Emmy nominations, 2 Gracie Awards, a Grierson, as well as Cable Ace and Genesis Award nominations. Mr. Smith is going to introduce our final panelist before we watch the short film, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute Mr. Smith. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Josette.
You're welcome.
Our second panelist is Vicki Williams Collins, who has been described as tenacious, authentic, passionate, a community activist, and a servant leader. All those things, Vicki. Vicki is determined to be a change agent within her sphere of influence. She is an entrepreneur and created Open Door Communications, a mediation, conflict coaching, and training firm. Open Door Communications was developed to help business and families resolve conflicts, communicate effectively, build relationships, retain relationships, maintain relationships, preserve relationships, and sever relationships with dignity and diplomacy. Vicki believes that education is the key to your success. She holds a BS in Business Administration from Elizabeth City State University, a Master's in Public Administration from Old Dominion University, and 4 certifications in mediations with the Virginia Supreme Court. Vicki believes that service is the rent that we pay to exist on Earth. She is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority for over 37 years and subscribes heavily to their belief that we must all give back to the community. Vicki is also an 11-year breast cancer survivor and is proof positive that being the project manager of your care is the key to claiming victory over this dreaded disease. Vicki has been recognized by such esteemed organizations as the Hampton Newport News Pan-Hellenic Council and the Virginia Inclusive Communities as one of their 2014 Humanitarian of the Year honorees for her work in the community. The topic again for our discussion is democracy in the time of COVID-19 and how America will adapt to this new reality of voting and maintaining a democracy during a raging pandemic. If you, Josette, they should post the questions in the chat function.
Yes, please post your questions on the Q&A tab, and we will get to them after a few questions from our moderator, Tim Smith. Go ahead, Tim.
And Josette, can I ask you to, I'm unable to access those for some reason, so could you do the questions in the chat function or whatever after
Absolutely.
I'm done? Okay, thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute our panelists. Vicki,
okay.
Are you able to respond?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And Jerry?
Oh, he's still...
Let me...
I guess I'll have to use the phone again, huh?
Yes, he's going to call in.
Okay, so I'll ask a question for Vicki first. Vicki, given what we saw happen in the primaries in Georgia and Washington during this age of COVID, what do you expect to happen with voting in the fall in Virginia? And what is the Virginia legislature doing to address the issue of voting by mail? Is the state sort of being proactive, or is it trying to suppress voters by kind of taking the Trump line of view that, you know, there can be a lot of fraud with absentee voting?
Absolutely not. Can everybody hear me, first of all?
Yes.
So Virginia has taken a very proactive view regarding absentee voting. And many years ago, I served as the absentee voting coordinator for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And for years, we were fighting for no excuse and for early voting. This time, this year, in this past legislature, they passed it for this election. So Virginia will have no excuse, and Virginia will have early voting, which will start on September 18th, and it will end on Saturday, October 31st. Another thing that Virginia has done is that the deadline to request your absentee ballot is now the Friday before, 10 days before the election, as opposed to 7 days before the election, which allows time for the ballot to get to you. Additionally, Virginia is also allowing that if the ballot is postmarked by election day, as long as it's postmarked and it gets to the Board of Elections by 3 days after November 3rd, then the ballot will be counted. Virginia has been very open about making these changes, and they started these changes last year to prepare for this year.
Now, will they also have drop-off boxes, or do you have to send it back by mail?
No, they don't. They don't have drop-off boxes unless the registrar has decided to have one there. Now,
Right.
Bigger counties may have that. Like a Fairfax County may have something like that, but they also have central absentee voting precincts. But for the most part, unless it's a special circumstance, if you are voting the ballot and you are delivering the ballot, it has to be you who is delivering that ballot. So,
And what races are in Virginia this November? Is there a Senate race? Obviously, there's not a governor, right, or the state legislature.
correct. Those races, the governor and the state legislative race was last November. This year, we have Congress and we have Warner, the only Senator Kane. He won last year, and Warner is up this year. And then we have congressional races. One thing about Virginia, we're going to have a race every year. And you may have some local elections that are coming up in November. So Virginia is always going to have an election every year, probably darn near every May and November. We're going to have election. Specifically, there may be special elections that pop up.
And do you know what the polls are showing now between Trump and Biden in Virginia, which is obviously a battleground state? Is it fairly even? Or?
Well, Virginia's gone blue. So it's been very positive in Virginia. You know, Virginia will turn. There are two areas of Virginia that can turn elections. Hampton Roads, where I'm in, and there's Northern Virginia. Those two areas are very large electoral areas, and they can absolutely turn an election. So right now, I would say Biden and Harris is looking good, but I'm not one who stands by the polls. We have been tricked, bamboozled, and hoodwinked in the past.
Right. Okay. Jerry, are you able to respond yet?
I believe so.
Okay, great. Welcome. As we saw in the film, can you discuss how voter suppression tactics have evolved and morphed since the 15th Amendment gave enslaved Black males the right to vote? Or of late, it seems that voter suppression is less overt and more covert, yet equally effective and detrimental to our democracy. I mean, one of the things, voter suppression is sort of like viruses. I mean, it evolves, it mutates, it's ever changing, and you sort of attack it in one place and then it's somewhere else. So can you speak to that? Oops. We can't hear you.
The evolution of voter suppression tactics from poll taxes to and literacy tests that were instituted after the passage of the 15th Amendment. We've gone from those days to the rise of strict photo ID laws, polling place closures, and purges, which seemingly all took place after the election of America's first Black president. Then 5 years into the Obama presidency, the Supreme Court struck down the strongest and most effective weapon in the history of our country when it comes to voting discrimination with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And what that did is it unleashed a series of vote suppression measures in states with a long history of discrimination. We saw massive voter suppression laws being enacted in Texas, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, just to name a few. Vote suppression, in my view, is really just the result of trying to maintain white supremacy in the political process and to keep minorities, whether they be African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, from exercising their effective and meaningful right to vote. And, you know, what we did after the Voting Rights Act was we had what I call the first generation of voting rights cases, which were vote denial cases. We had to get people registered. We had to then let them vote at the polls free of violence and intimidation, and we got through that. And then we went on to kind of break down a lot of the structures that were instituted over the years, at-large elections, multi-member districts, gerrymandering, and we were attacking those for a few decades in the courts, and some legislatures were fixing some of those problems. But now we're back actually to the first generation, the vote denial, vote suppression measures, which are aimed at keeping people from voting. And we see this right now playing out in the 2020 election cycle, where we've had literally dozens, probably close to 100 lawsuits already being filed across the country, trying to either get the states to expand the opportunity for voting, or in some cases, political parties going into court to try to stop voting enhancement during the pandemic.
Vicki, some of the protesters in the wake of George Floyd's murder questioned the very relevance of voting, saying that even though they voted in the past, nothing really changes. The criminal justice system is still racist, gun control is not happening, disruptive climate change continues apace, healthcare is based on one's wealth and race. What do you say to those who belittle the power of the vote? You know, I take it you're a firm believer in voting and the power of the vote, but how do you respond to those who just feel like things haven't changed even though they voted?
I am a very strong proponent of the power to vote. My mother paid the poll tax, $1.52 in Arkansas when she voted in 1955. So what I would say to folks, and what I do say to folks, is they wouldn't suppress your vote. They wouldn't fight so hard to suppress your vote if it wasn't powerful. That's number one. Number two, you got to understand civics, and you got to understand that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. It seems as if nothing has changed, but everything has changed and everything has actually stayed the same. Because if you're just waiting for just it to change systematically within you, you still got to engage with your legislators. You still got to know how civics works. And a lot of times what happens is they've taken civics out of schools, and they also have not taught us the power of engagement. They show the pictures, they show the films of people like Congressman Lewis and who actually were beaten brutally because they were trying to grasp the power of the vote, which they had the ability to vote since the 15th Amendment. However, people know that if I suppress your power, then I can control you. So I go back and I tell folks, there's a lot more at stake than just the vote. It's how your country is run, and that, you know, elections are all local. If you know how it impacts you intrinsically, then you would really know that they are fighting so hard because you're such a powerful being.
Well, obviously, I think Virginia is an example of, really fighting at the local level to sort of secure control of the legislature. The sister district and a number of groups have really worked hard to kind of turn the legislature away from being Republican. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, we turned Virginia blue. Virginia is blue from the top all the way down in last November, which is really interesting because of the changes that have been made. You know, Virginia did a lot of voter suppressive covert tactics, as Jerry had stated. You know, the voter ID bill. You know, people think, and you illustrated that in your film, that it's not about 90% of the folks who have an ID. It's the 10%, the 15%, and all these things that are cumbersome. We took that away. So Virginia has done everything that they possibly can do to make it a fair and equitable state. Our next battle is regarding redistricting and gerrymandering, and that's where we are at this particular moment. That's on our constitutional amendment in November.
Thank you. Jerry, President Trump and many other Republicans talk about widespread voter fraud when it comes to mail-in balloting. Is there any credence to this concern, or is voter fraud a Trojan horse for voter suppression?
Well, first of all, voter fraud is a myth. It happens in isolated examples. It doesn't normally happen by people impersonating somebody at the polls. Where it does happen occasionally, and again, it's still rare. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning than you do finding voter fraud. So let me give you an example out of Texas. So Texas enacted a photo ID law, and it went into effect immediately when the Supreme Court struck down the Voting Rights Act, so we had to go into court to challenge it. And they said that a photo ID was necessary to prevent voter fraud, that people were not impersonating people at the polls. Now think about this. This is why this doesn't happen. If I want to impersonate somebody at the polls, say I want to impersonate you, Tim Smith.
A participant has joined the meeting.
I go to the polls and I say, I'm Tim Smith. Well, first of all, I have to hope they don't know you, because if they know you, they know I'm not you. I have to hope they don't know me, because if they know me, they know I'm not you. I have to hope that you haven't voted yet, because if you have, I'm trying to vote a second time and I'm going to get caught. And then thirdly, I'm going to do this, commit a felony in front of all of these poll officials who technically are government officials for purposes of an election. Now, when Texas enacted their law, we challenged it in court, and we proved that there was no voter impersonation fraud. And in fact, what we did show was that when Texas decided, and Vicki, this will be dovetailing with what you said a few minutes ago, when they enacted their law, they picked the IDs that were disproportionately not held by minorities. So they eliminated the ability to use a student ID. You couldn't use a city ID. You couldn't even use a state ID, the one the legislators used to enact the discriminatory law. And all of those were disproportionately held by minorities. And they rejected amendment after amendment to have those IDs being used. Now, here's the thing about fraud. They also said they wanted to prevent, quote, illegal aliens, close quote, from voting, and they needed to have a photo ID law for that. But then they added as an amendment that an acceptable ID was a license to carry a firearm in Texas, which is possessed by 90% of the people who possess that license to carry a firearm are white, and you don't have to be a citizen to even get a license to carry a firearm in Texas. So ultimately, based on all the evidence the court took, including the fact that the defense of voter fraud was mythical and non-existent, and that in fact Texas couldn't have been preventing non-citizens from voting because they allowed this exception for people carrying a firearm licenses, they lost. It took us 6 years to litigate that case, which I think underscores again what I said earlier about the Supreme Court making it more difficult, not only for minority voters, but lawyers representing minority voters to go into court. 6 years is a several $1 million legal bill. And who can afford that?
Plus 6 years where a lot of elections went by. Vicki, given your impressive bio, I feel like you have a sense of the citizens of Virginia. Can you speak to me about how they're feeling about the upcoming election? Not so much who they're going to vote for, but about the pandemic and sort of their fears about voting and going to the polling place. And what is the state of mind of the citizens in Virginia these days?
Thank you so much. You got half and half. You got a lot of folks. First of all, the people that I know, and I've been working with people, you have people who are apathetic. They don't think any change is going to come. So they're like, I'm going to withhold my vote. You have that group. And that's a small group, but it's a vocal group. And then you have the group of folks who are saying, I don't trust absentee voting. I'm going to show up at the polls. And I'm going to stay and I'm going to wait till whenever until my vote is cast because I don't trust them. And then you've got people who are now ready to take access to early voting. They're really down. They're really open to that. And that's something that I'm going to do because I want to be helping out at the polls. But the other thing is people are very, very apprehensive about the absentee vote. They still are under the misnomer that your ballot doesn't count. They're very concerned about that. They're also very concerned with the post office and all the challenges that are coming across with that. If I mail my vote off, is it going to get there in time? They don't trust the government. They don't trust the federal government. They don't trust the post office and they don't trust the postmaster. So that's really, really problematic. And I tell folks all the time, your absentee ballot is counted. Now, one thing I forgot to share that Virginia has done is that Virginia required witnesses, a witness to witness your absentee ballot. Now, if you don't have a witness because you're afraid because of COVID, you don't have to do that. That's an administrative rule, but it's not the law. But it's only to this election, only for November 2020 because of COVID. But I'll be honest with you, Tim, people in Virginia are afraid. They're afraid that their vote, not that it's going to not be counted, but that it won't be counted on time, especially people who are voting absentee. But you got folks out there who are really going to stand in line and do what they got to do and vote.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Jerry, how worried are you that the states that haven't done massive vote by mail in the past, and only really 5 states have done it, what is it, Utah and Washington and Oregon and Hawaii, are you worried that they don't have the time and the money to do it right, that it could be kind of chaos like we saw in Georgia and Wisconsin, during the primaries?
Well, I am worried about that. And let me give you a couple of examples. I don't understand why lawmakers in some states, like Pennsylvania and Michigan are good examples, are not changing policies to permit election officials to start processing absentee ballots earlier than usual, given the volume of absentee ballots that are going to get cast this fall. The real danger, I think, is a perfect catastrophe, as Vicki has said, of administrative overload. There's going to be delays at the post office. There's voter errors that happen that could lead to millions of absentee ballots not being counted. And this year, like the past, mail-in ballots are going to be, absentee ballots are going to be largely cast, I think, overwhelmingly by Democratic voters. So the problem is it a problem for Democrats? I think it is. Absentee ballots are rejected at higher rates than those cast in person. And academic study after academic study shows that younger voters and voters of color, who are oftentimes some of the Democrats' most reliable voters, that they're more likely to cast mail ballots that end up getting rejected, and they're less likely to take steps to cure their ballots if election officials flag them for signature mismatch problems and the like. I would only add to what Vicki said about Virginia is that one good thing also in Virginia is that if you do vote by mail, once you vote by mail, you can actually track your ballot online, just like you could an Amazon package, to see if it made it to the registrar's office. And one other thing about Virginia is we start voting, you can vote early without excuse now, 45 days before the election. So that's coming up in the middle of September. Don't go on the first day, because everybody, I'm told, is going to try to start voting early on the first day or second day or third day at the voter registration office or any satellite polling places that are open for early voting. I was told by my registrar that I should wait a week or so, but don't wait too long. Time is of the essence.
Vicki, what would you suggest to people who sort of want to help with the election? What are some of the things they can do? One of the ideas I hear shared is people should volunteer, especially younger people should volunteer to be poll workers, because generally in the past poll workers have been older people, and they're the ones that are increasingly frightened to be poll workers because of COVID. It's obviously what happened in Milwaukee, where they went from 85 polling places to 5 during the primary because just the older people didn't want to work. Do you know anything about what's being done to try and man the polls in Virginia?
Absolutely. So we're heavily recruiting. Another, and I want to add something else that people can do is they can be regarding voter protection, making sure that people are not intimidated. They have some nonpartisan groups that are training people for voter protection. And I know they're asking attorneys to also volunteer to do voter protection. We want people to be poll workers. We want groups to organize rides to the polls. So we call it Souls to the Polls. But now that we have early voting, we're going to need people to give rides to these CAPs, central absentee voting districts, and central absentee precincts, as well as the satellite voting offices. So we are going to need to have all hands on deck because of some of the things that Trump has said regarding bringing officers to the polling places. Well, whether you're doing anything wrong or not, and I'm just going to speak for me being a Black woman, I'm always concerned if there's a police officer near. I'm not always looking at them for protection. I'm looking at them for involving me into something I don't have any business. So we have to protect the voters in line, regardless of who you're voting for. And so voting protection, poll workers, they are absolutely doing their best to recruit younger poll workers, because if you stated traditionally, you have people 75, 80, 65 years old, and they're more susceptible to COVID. So we got to make sure that we protect them.
So, Jerry, I mean, you obviously keep your, track of these things. Do you feel like Virginia is in pretty good shape when it comes to voting in November? Have they made the right changes?
Well, they certainly are a lot better today than they were a few years ago. So, yes, I do think things have changed. The legislature responded. It enacted a lot of progressive reforms, which are good. So I think in comparison to some other states, yeah, I do think they're in better shape. But, I just think that we all need to prepare for there to be a lot of mail-in ballots, unlike never before. We need to realize that because of that volume and because there will be so many coming in on or before Election Day, just before, that it may take officials some time to count all those ballots. So typically, we know on the night of the presidential election, the networks are calling all these states. But given the volume of mail ballots or absentee ballots, which are the same thing, we may not know for 24 or more hours if the election is close in a state, how those electoral votes are going to get cast. So I think that's something that what Americans really need to consider is the fact that it's more important that every single vote that's cast gets counted. That's what's important, and that the election therefore would be fair if everybody who casts a ballot gets their ballot counted, and instead of worrying about whether or not we're going to have a decision by 7 p.m. or 8 p.m.
Josette, I'm going to turn it back to you to take any of the questions from the chats.
Sure. We've had a couple of questions come in. Some things were already partially discussed, but I will ask them again in case there's any additional points that wanted to be made. Question, are there any changes due to the issues we are seeing with the U.S. Post Office?
Jerry, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, as of now, the postmaster has assured that they will be able to deliver mail ballots, and you have somewhat of a conflicting story because you have a lot of postal workers who say that due to all the cutbacks and all of the machinery changes and overtime denials, that there's going to be delays. So I guess what I would say is I don't really see the Congress or the Senate in particular enacting sufficient money and to restore the Postmaster General's reduction and changes that he implemented, which I think is what the House would really like to see. Having said that, I do think that if you are going to vote by mail, apply for your ballot as soon as you're able and mail it early and then track it.
Okay, thank you. Josette, another question?
I'm sorry. I just want to jump in and tag on to what Jerry had mentioned.
Okay, please.
I also am very concerned with our uniformed and overseas citizens. They heavily rely on mail-in ballots because, of course, they're outside of the country or they're on ships and things of that nature. So it's very important that because this is a federal election, that they use their federal write-in absentee ballot, which it also can serve as a registration form. And they need to mail them off now because it may take a longer time because you've got to go through the military mail and then it has to go through the postal service. And also, even though I hate to say this, you may want to use a paid service provider to get your ballot there. And actually, it's worth the money.
So a FedEx or a UPS. Josette?
Yes, Jerry, one thing I would like you to, if you can, post the website that you were mentioning for people to track their ballot. If you could post that in the chat, that would be great so that our participants can see what that is. And let's see, the second question that we have is, what protections will be in place for people who will be working at the polls?
Vicki, do you know anything to that regard? Or?
Protections for people working at the polls. So if you mean election officials, I think that it's fairly certain that for people working at the polls, they are going to be required to wear masks. There will be sanitizer, there'll be social distancing, there'll be disinfectant wipe downs of every piece of voting machinery after each voter uses it. And so that's what election officials, I think, are going to face to keep them as safe as we possibly can. With regard to the site for tracking your ballot, each county or city is going to have their own tracking link on their election, the registrar of voters website. So in your city of Norfolk, for example, you just go on the city of Norfolk's voting registrar website, and they may have it up already. Some of them are waiting just another week or two to put the tracking information up because you really can't track ballots yet, absentee ballots, because they haven't been mailed to voters yet. So they don't want people to get all frustrated trying to track their ballot early, so they're holding back posting the link. But I would just encourage people to go on to the city of Norfolk if you're in Norfolk, or if you're in Virginia Beach's registrar, and look for the link there to track your ballot.
Let me also respond to something Vicki brought up. In terms of people who are having trouble voting, and there's a group called the Lawyers Committee, and is it 1-800-OUR-VOTE, Jerry?
1-866-OUR-VOTE.
Our vote. So if you're having trouble voting, or you feel like you've been, disenfranchised or purged, or if something just doesn't feel right when you go to vote, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. There are people standing by. I'm sure they start in mid-September, Jerry, or whenever the early voting starts.
Yes, they'll start during early voting, and they also can answer questions like, I don't know where my polling place is, or I don't know if I'm registered, which is one more thing that people can do is you should check now your registration to make sure it's up to date. You don't want to go to the polls and take the time to vote and maybe stand in line and then find that, your registration lapsed for some reason or another. So I would encourage people to check now.
Or you were purged like the woman in our film.
Exactly. I mean, you don't want to have that happen to you. It's very frustrating, and it's embarrassing to go to the polls and be told you can't vote.
Josette, any more questions?
Yes, let me go back here. Everything's popping up. Will you have plexiglass barriers similar to what is in place at retail establishments?
That's up to the election officials in each city and county to decide how best to protect voters at the polls. I suspect that in some places where they have the resources to do it, they will. I wouldn't think maybe necessarily in some of the rural areas that they will have the resources to do that. But I think, what I understand is that they're going to try to take every precaution possible. But you can always call your local voting elections office and ask. They're pretty responsive, and they'll do their best to answer your questions. At least they have been doing the best to answer ours when we call.
Anything to add, Vicki?
I want to just reiterate, if you have any people that you know who are serving in the military, living overseas, encourage them to vote. Encourage them to use their federal write-in absentee ballot. Encourage them to go to www.fvap.gov, and that covers that. And I'm going to go back to what Jerry had stated. Check your status. Make sure that you're not purged. Check your registration status. Virginia has an automatic type of purging type situation if you're not voting in I think 2 consistent federal elections. You got to check your status. You need to know your polling places. I put the links on in the chat. And if you want to request your absentee ballot, do it now. If you want to vote in person, do it as soon as you are able to do it, and be patient. And, Virginia is giving folks at least 3 days. So just like Jerry says, the data may not be certified on election day because they still have 3 extra days. They're trying to be mindful of the influx of ballots. So definitely check your status, vote, and vote.
Vicki, let me ask Vicki a quick question. What is your sense about the youth vote? Obviously, both of the presidential candidates are fairly old. Do you sense any enthusiasm or more enthusiasm than in 2016, where the youth vote kind of dropped off?
Yeah, I sensed a whole lot of enthusiasm with Kamala Harris, especially in the Black Greek organization community, especially in the HBCU community.
Which you are part of, so you would know about that.
Absolutely. I graduated from HBCU, Elizabeth City State University. I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And the fact that Kamala Harris graduated from Howard and that she's a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, as well as a member of the Links, has galvanized a lot of young African-American folks who are amazed that someone not maybe 20 or 30 years out, but still has a relatable element. I think it really has reached out to a lot of folks. While when you look over on Trump's side, no disrespect to you gentlemen, but it's just 2 old white men. And no disrespect, but I'm just going to keep it 100.
Jerry and I are in our 30s.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. My
bad.
bad.
Look older.
Okay, I got you. But I'm just going to keep it 100. And so I think adding her to the ticket really put a lot of energy into it. And plus, she may be 55, 56, but she still moves and grooves like a young person.
Right.
And she can relate. And I think that's really important. And I think it's going to make a turn in this race.
Josette, back to you.
Sure. The next one that had come in, I think we've touched on, but in case there's any additions, the question was asked, is there anything within the Virginia Code that would allow for purging of the voter rolls? Anything to add for that?
The only thing I would add to what we haven't said before is that there's a federal law that prevents purges within a certain period before the election. And we're within that period now. So no state can do any of these massive purges between now and election day, and no matter what state you're in, including Virginia. So that's a good thing. So we will not see a big systematic purge before November 3rd.
Has Virginia done purges in the last 2 years?
Not the way that other states like Ohio and Georgia have. They take people off the rolls when they get notices of death, and they can also take people off the rolls when they move and they're notified that they're now living in another state. And they can take people off the rolls when they don't vote for several successive federal elections. But those are not the systematic across-the-board purges where we've seen hundreds of thousands of people being taken off the rolls, often with no notice to the voter.
Right.
Gerry, you were on point there, friend.
Thank you. Pretty good for an old white guy, right, Vicki?
Hey, you're on point.
Josette, anything else? Or
Yeah, we had a comment that Norfolk successfully held in-person local elections in May, and I can confirm that I was a poll worker. So it is happening. And then the next thing was, I've concluded that early voting is preferable to mail-in because of DeRoy's shenanigans. Am I wrong?
No, I actually am not voting in person. I am voting in person myself early, and I'm not doing it by mail. And I do think there's a concern about, if you really want to make sure that your vote has been cast and is in the box, so to speak, then I would go early. I would say, though, that in the city of Norfolk, I suspect this is true as well, because it's certainly true in Alexandria. There are going to be several satellite places open where you can go and vote early. Usually, at least two others, I believe, in Alexandria. The cities have to apply to the State Board of Elections and get approval, but it's an administrative thing. It doesn't take long. So I would say that if I were a voter in Norfolk, I would do what I'm doing here in Alexandria. I would go and vote early. And that way I know, I see myself actually putting my ballot in the machine or in the box. And I know it's been received and it will be counted.
Vicki, how are you going to vote?
I'm going to vote early, just like Gerry.
Uh-huh.
They have a satellite location that they opened in Hampton. It's I think, the historic post office, which was very unusual. I've lived in Hampton since I was 18, and I voted absentee. I voted absentee for years. This is the first time that I'm struggling with the mail-in ballot, and I'm going to co-sign with Gerry. I'm going to vote early, and I'm going to vote in person.
Right.
And let me just add one other thing, Tim and Josette, which is that when you vote by mail, there's a lot of opportunity for error. You can fail to sign your application. You can fail to sign the ballot in the right place. And oftentimes, if it comes in just before the election, there's no time really to correct that error. In addition, your signature on your application to vote absentee, as well as your ballot, absentee ballot, that signature gets viewed in comparison to the signature that is on file when you registered to vote. Now, if you're as old as I am, my signature on my voter registration card from years ago when I first registered is a lot different, I think, than my signature today. And so if it doesn't match in many states, that mismatch can result in your ballot not being counted. So why take a chance to do that? Why not just vote in person if you're able to do so?
Anything else, Josette, in terms of questions?
Yes. Another question is, Norfolk is considering using library drop boxes to collect absentee ballots. Any reservations about this?
No, I think they're a wonderful idea, actually, and they are where they've been used during the primaries. They've been lauded by voters and election officials. What that's going to allow is that more convenience. Because there's an opportunity to, drop your ballot in a box that's closer to your neighborhood. Let me just give you one example of vote suppression back to the first question. In Ohio, the Secretary of State announced that every county in the state is only allowed to have one box early where you can drop your ballot in the early voting box, one per county, and not even considering the fact that some counties have only a couple of thousand people, and then you have some counties where Cleveland and Columbus are that have hundreds and hundreds of thousands. So they're being sued by the American Civil Liberties Union, so stay tuned for that. But I do think those early drop boxes are have been are going to be really popular with voters.
Well, in the states where that do vote by mail exclusively, like Utah and Washington and Oregon, the drop boxes are actually used 80% of the time. In other words, very rarely do people actually mail their ballots back. They use the drop boxes 80% of the time to return their ballots.
Yeah, and the reason for that is because they know it's received, because they see themselves putting it in the box. They don't have to worry about where it is in the mail or, you know.
Any more questions?
One last question. So how do we get involved to help voters get to the polls? I'm willing and able.
Vicki?
You're muted, Vicki, I think.
Okay, here I am. There will be organizations out. I would check with your local civic organizations, the NAACP, the
League of Women Voters.
League of Women Voters, and local sororities and fraternities will probably be starting to recruit voters to take people to the polls. I also want to encourage you to reach out to your registrar's office and volunteer to be a poll worker. That would be enormously helpful. And definitely, if you're in the Hampton area, you can get my email address and reach out to me, and I'll put it in the chat, and I'll see who I can connect you with if you're in the Hampton area or even the Hampton Roads area.
Is that it, Josette?
Those were all of the questions that had come in.
All right. Well, let me, as the moderator, thank my two panelists, Vicki Williams and Jerry Hebert, for taking part today. One other thing, I think Josette is going to post in the chat. We have something called the Democracy Playbook, which shows how to, sort of on a micro and macro level, to reverse the voter suppression tactics. And if you go to our website, www.rigthefilm.com, you can access that Democracy Playbook. And that's all I have to say. Josette?
I will go ahead and put that in the chat for sure. And thank you, Tim. Thank you to our panelists. I'm going to post that link, which was created by Mr. Smith's company, the American Issues Initiative. It gives macro and micro advice on how to counter voter suppression tactics. Finally, please remember to register and to vote this November. Our fragile democracy depends on your active participation. A big thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Please also consider joining us for our next program, Democracy and the Informed Citizen, taking place on Thursday, September 3rd at 6 p.m., also via WebEx. I'm going to include the registration link in the chat, along with the link to the website, riggedthefilm.com. I'm going to do that right now. That's the link for the Eventbrite for our next one, in case anyone is interested in coming to Democracy and the Informed Citizen. And then there is www.riggedthefilm.com. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a good evening and a good weekend. We'll come around for a few more minutes in case there's any last-minute things you want to put in the chat, but thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you. Good night.